All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Byrne. To my left is Ian Whitmire, and to Ian's left is Derek Law, and we're glad you chose this as the session to attend during this time slot. This is going to be pretty much of a fire hose session, so we're going to move pretty quickly. And since this is the last session of the day, we can hang out and take some questions after we run out of time here. We've till, I think, 6:30, but we'll keep on going. All right, this session is going to talk about building great apps with ArcGIS Online, and we're going to focus a lot on configurable apps. These are apps that don't require any programming, but we'll show you some extensions that you can use through some CSS and HTML to extend them, and we also will cover source code, and we'll do those as we progress in this section. So first question might be, what are ready to configure apps? These are hosted apps that are maintained by Esri in the cloud, and it's the fastest and easiest way to go from a map to a shareable app. What's really interesting about these is that Esri hosts them so that when updates occur, they are automatically updated as well. So if you're leveraging these in your work and you're extending them through CSS or HTML, those updates automatically come into play. These are designed for you to configure, assemble, and build with no programming required, and they basically fall into three different categories now. New with the last release are these three tabs that you'll see in the Create a New Web App dialog. There's Configurable Apps, Web App Builder, and then Operations Dashboard. For Web App Builder, there is a developer edition. For Configurable Apps, the source code is available, but there is no source available for the Operations Dashboard, which is the new tab which appears on that dialog. Now, web maps are what make everything happen in the ArcGIS Online ecosystem. They're the building blocks of WebGIS, and I always say that at Esri, a web map is more than a map in a browser. It's a technical specification that all the product development teams adhere to. So you can make a web map in ArcGIS Pro, you can make one in the map viewer, and they're all interoperable, and other applications and know how to use those and take advantage of those. We always say a great app starts with a great map. So there's a little bit of tradecraft here, which we're not going to cover, which goes into play. So an app is no better than the experience, which includes the experience through the web map itself, which includes some really great cartography, might include leveraging things like transparency, scale ranges to make things performant, using bookmarks, configuring great pop-ups. These are all things that we're not going to cover, but are certainly part of creating a great map. I should also mention that the web map itself can be a kernel of building custom applications using our JavaScript API. So you don't have to write all the code to manage layer transparency and scale ranges and things like that. Through the API, you can build a web map and then you can consume that directly, even if you're working at the JavaScript API level. We always think that an app completes the user experience. So there we have a nicely made app that's visually appealing, that's got great pop-ups and cartography, but really what makes that thing hum and work is what happens around it, the application experience. So the apps allow you to present map information tools in meaningful ways to your target audience. And that could be people in other departments, it could be a public audience, it could be a workforce that's out in the field. So by configuring these apps for those tasks, you can make everything work for that target audience. So where do you find these? There is a Create a New Web App gallery, which is found in the sharing workflow. So you author a map, you share it, you'll find the button called Create a Web App. Click that, and there's a gallery of all the different applications that you can choose from. And you'll also see tabs at the top for Web App Builder and Operations Dashboard, and we're going to cover all three of those. There's other places where you can find configurable apps. If you're interested in building story maps, you will find those in this Create a New Web App gallery. But for story maps, there's storymaps.arcgis.com, and that's the better place to go if you're interested in story maps and want to learn more about them and how to use them and look at what other people have done and so forth. There's also a collection of solutions applications. So we have solution templates for various industries. You'll find them on the Esri.com website, and you can download other configurable apps at solutions.arcgis.com, and we're not going to really cover those here in this session. One thing to keep in mind is that when you build an application, it's going to be dependent upon other maps and other layers and other things that might be part of that application. So you need to ensure that those things don't accidentally vanish during some housekeeping chore. So there is a setting in the Settings tab for a map or any other item. You can set the delete protection on that, which means that it can't be accidentally deleted. So you have to uncheck the box and save it to be able to delete it, and that's always a good practice as you move through with your applications. And I'm just going to get everybody started with just a real quick overview of the basics here. So here I have a finely crafted web map, and I'm actually using one of the vector tile base maps here. This is one of the newer ones, and it's called the dark blue canvas. And I've got some custom symbols, and these custom symbols, there's something interesting going on behind the scenes. You can see we've got different colors, but we're also using different colors in the pop-ups. And one area where maybe a little bit of coding expertise might come into play is something called Arcade. So Arcade is something new in ArcGIS Online as of a couple of releases ago, and we call this an expression builder. So here's some Arcade expressions which have been built. I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail, but as we look at these expressions, what it allows us to do is, in this case, we're looking at attribute values, and we're going to use the result of this expression to control how the pop-up looks and feels. There's some really, really creative things that you can do here. The Arcade help is quite expansive and quite good, and it's a very easy scripting language, if you will, that you can use to do some custom things. So if I look at how this was configured, each of these is an expression, and depending on how these evaluate, it controls what happens in the pop-up. And in this example, we've got 3 expressions. Only one of them will be true, and that will control the color. So as I click here, right, one of them was true, so we get a green color here in the pop-up. One of the other ones is true, so we get a red color here in the pop-up. And in this one, the other condition is true, so we get a blue color in the pop-up. So I won't really go into this in a lot more detail, but that's Arcade, and it's a really powerful way for you to build some really, really creative experiences with pop-ups and other parts of the ecosystem. Once we've created a map, I'll of course want to save it, and then I'll want to go ahead and share it, and I can make some decisions about how it's shared. And to access the gallery, I click Create a Web App. And there's a bunch of different categories here that I can choose from. And one of the things I want to do with this app is to showcase it. So I've chosen that, and these are the configurable apps that are meant to showcase a map so they don't get in the way of the map in this case. Now, this is the basic viewer. It's a very popular one. I can preview what my map looks like in the default configuration. And there it is. You can see it's got a nice set of tools, including a base map gallery. It's got a layer checklist, and it's got some print and other tools which are there by default. But if I want to change the behavior here, what I'll do is create a web app. I'll need to give it a new name. And then once I do, I can click Done, and that launches the configuration panel for this particular application. Each application has a slightly different configuration panel. They're very similar in terms of how they're organized and some of the basic capabilities. But what we do at this point is just make some decisions about what happens here. We can do different things with the color. We've got some options here for which tools we want to display. And once I'm happy with that, I click Save. And that saves our configuration, and then we can go ahead and launch it and take a look at what it looks like here. In that preview panel was exactly the changes that we've made. So I've made a couple of minor changes, and this is our app, and that's how it starts. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ian, who's going to cover this in more detail.
Thanks, Bern. So as Bern showed, one of the questions that we pose is, what do you want to accomplish? Or more specifically, what do you want to do? We've categorized each application based on a broad use case. So as you're building applications with the configurable apps, it's useful to try that preview option that Bern showed to sort of see what your map looks like in the context of the different apps. In the demo that we saw from the map viewer, there's a subset of the categories. If you access this gallery from the Create menu on the content page, you'll get additional options for displaying a scene or making a gallery. And for the collect and edit data, you'll also get access to the crowdsourced applications. So for the configurable apps, we've got 3 different application types. You can use a map, a scene, or a group to create an application. So as far as the map and the scene applications go, there's some things that you'll want to consider when you're authoring your map or your scene. There's certain tools or applications that have requirements of the map that you would author in the map viewer in order to facilitate or leverage that feature in the resulting application. Things like bookmarks, filters, time-aware settings, that sort of thing. Similarly, I guess to go off of Bernd's comment earlier, a great map or a great app starts with a great map. A great gallery application really starts with a great item. So authoring an item, title, good thumbnail, useful tags, and sharing it appropriately is going to make your gallery really look nicer. And you can see here is a poorly crafted set of items. You have default thumbnails, you have a lack of spacing in some of the names. So this is what we want to avoid through our examples. Let me go into the map viewer. So we'll start with maps. So in this case, I've authored a map with bookmarks. And this is a map I made of places in Ireland. There was an exorbitant amount of James Joyce related features, so I took advantage of that and made a set of bookmarks that go to those places. Then when I created an application using the basic viewer, those bookmarks are just picked up and I can leverage that same tradecraft from the map inside the context of the app without having to do any additional stuff. You can also, one thing that we didn't see earlier, you can also choose with the basic viewer which widget loads first. So sometimes that's useful to orient users. In this case, I didn't use a splash screen. You could do that, but I've loaded the details of the map first so that there's a little bit more text to help orient them. Another thing that I briefly mentioned earlier in the slides is a filter. So in order to be successful with the filter application, in the map, you'll need to author a filter and you'll need to check ask for values and provide some prompt and hint text. What that does is it lets the filter application read that information and know which field is going to accept new values, and it provides a call to action to the end user so they understand more clearly what to provide as they modify that. So this map, you can see I've used the filter application, and all of the values that were authored in that filter dialog are going to show up here. So as I start to change the filter, the map will update and we'll see the map change as the end user interacts. So those are just 2 simple examples of things that you need to author in the map in order to facilitate the application. And then as I mentioned, you can access this share dialog or the create app gallery from the create menu in content. You can choose using a template, using Web App Builder, or using Operations Dashboard from that location. When you launch using a template version, you will get these additional options for displaying a scene or for making a gallery. And in the screenshot, we saw a gallery using the minimal gallery where the items were kind of poorly crafted. Here's an example that uses a lot more of the best practices that we would advocate for authoring an item. So you can see that there's a nice thumbnail. In this case, we've branded each thumbnail with Online Labs graphics. All of the titles are useful. There's no underscores or that sort of thing. And it just makes a much nicer experience for this because the way that you build a quality gallery is by authoring those items. And if you author high quality items in general, it's going to make, I think, your users a little bit more confident in the content that you're creating. So the other thing that you can do here is to create a scene application, and I'll just walk through that. So in this case, I'm not starting with a specific item type, so it's not going to discover that I already have provided a scene. So I'll have to provide some metadata. If we did it from the scene viewer or from the map viewer, it would detect some of the titles and tags. In this case, it's going to prompt me to select a scene from my content. I'll choose one on refugees. And as Bern mentioned, any of the kind of standard configurable apps have a shared application that they use, and we've tried to standardize as much as possible the content of those. So in this case, I think what I'd like to do is turn the legend on as the active tool. So I'll just make a small change, and then when I launch it, you'll see that the legend is now loading by default. So that's using Styler. We have two versions of the Styler, one that uses scenes as input and one that uses maps as input. They're both built using the 4x JavaScript API. And I think with that, oh wait, one more thing. This is another 3D application. This one compares two scenes. In this case, I've authored the scenes to show kind of a 2D and 3D view side by side. And you can kind of interact with that through the slides that have been authored. One of the things that we're working on for a future release is to let this application take a map and a scene as input so that they will be a more truly side-by-side comparison of 2D and 3D. But this is just sort of to kind of get your brains thinking about 3D and experimenting with what we have to see what's possible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Derek. Oh, sorry, Bertie.
Okay, we're going to pick up here with a little section on story maps. And story maps are one of the more popular and publicly visible parts of the entire ArcGIS platform. They're very popular and many different uses for all of these. A key place to go, which lots of people don't actually know about, is if you want to learn more about story maps, look at a gallery, learn how to use them. Storymaps.arcgis.com is the place for you to go. And I'll show you some tools and some reasons why that would be your destination if you want to build story maps. The reason is that all the resources you need to learn about and figure out how to create story maps are found there. There's a showcase and gallery. There's a little wizard that helps guide you to the correct story map application to use. There's tutorials, there's training. There's something called My Stories, which is a way for you to kind of do a health check on all the story map apps that you've built. There's documentation, links to a filtered blog just about story maps. And Planet Story Maps is our newsletter, which comes out periodically, and you can find a way to subscribe there. The developer information is embedded in that website as well. I'll cover the developer opportunities with story maps in a later section, but basically it's everything you need to succeed. My Stories, I think, is probably the most useful part of that entire website. A story map typically uses lots of maps, lots of media, maybe links to web pages and other resources, and sometimes it's kind of hard to keep track of all of those. What My Stories does is it's a filter on your content, and it displays all of your story maps, and it has a checker that will review, go behind the scenes in each of your story maps and let you know if there's something that you need to pay attention to. So for example, in the what we see here popped up was one of the story maps uses subscription content from the Living Atlas, and that hadn't been proxied for public consumption. So it's letting me know that that's the case, and it's allowing me to do that by clicking the confirm button. And just to be clear on that, Living Atlas, a lot of the content is free, available to anybody, but there's some content that is available to subscribers only. What that means is you need to have an organizational account. There's actually two kinds of subscription content. Subscriber content just requires you to have an account. For some of the demographics, it's what's called premium content, which means not only do you need to have an account, but if you publish that in public-facing maps or in any other maps, it actually will deduct some credits from your account. Pretty small amount of credits, but if something went viral, it might be something to think about. But those are the two Living Atlas types of content. When you're making a story map, there's two workflows, and one is what I think of as the map-centric workflow, which is the one that we've just covered. You author the map, you share it, you click Create a Web App, and there's a Build a Story Map category which filters out just the story maps in the Create a New Web App gallery. Now, I don't often recommend that simply because most story maps use more than one web map and they have lots of other media as well. So my typical workflow is to think about the web maps I need, craft them really well and make them. I'll favorite them because that's a little shortcut when you're searching for apps. If they're in your favorites, you can find them easily. Otherwise, you browse and find them. Add them to your story map, and I also do all my media beforehand too, figure out where I'm going to store that, and then I will use the website to launch the application or to start the builder, and that's the recommended workflow. So go to the Story Maps website at storymaps.arcgis.com, browse the gallery, find the app you want to use, and then go ahead and launch the builder and create a story. There's a little button you can find that helps you guide your way through things. Story maps use a builder. It's not quite, it's different than the configuration panel that Ian just demonstrated. And it's sort of almost like a wizard. It kind of guides you stepwise through the process. Each story map builder is unique because each story map is unique and intended to tell stories in different ways or build applications in different ways. So all the builders are unique, but they do use some common foundational elements. So once you've used a couple of them, you'll recognize bits and pieces. Another thing to keep in mind is that story maps have multiple layouts. So this is the story map series, and at the click of a button in the builder, you can switch the layout from bulleted, which is in the upper left, to tab, which is down at the bottom in the middle, and also to side accordion. So without having to do any code changes or changes to your map or anything, you can just choose a different layout and you get an entirely different look and feel. So let's take a look at how that might work. Now I'm going to begin with that map-centric workflow. So here I am in the map viewer, and I have a super simple map of Manhattan, which only has one layer, which is a historical map, which I've overlain on top of this. You can see that interesting little marginalia here on the side. So what I would like to do is I would like to compare the historic map with the current day map, and I can leverage one of the story maps to do that. First thing I need to do is save my work. And then I can go ahead and share it and find that Create a Web App button. And this is exactly where we were previously, but here I'm going to build a story map. So this filters for me all of the story maps that are in this gallery. And the one I'm looking for is actually the story map Swipe and Spyglass, which is right here. So a similar user experience. Here's where I could download the source code, but I can preview it from here, or I can go ahead and create the web app, and that's what I'll do. So in this case, I'll just add the word swipe at the end, since that's what I want to do, and we'll click done. So, and with what Ian showed, this took you to the configuration panel for the apps. What this does is it launches the builder for this story map, and this is the builder for the story map swipe. And the builders guide you through the process. The default is a vertical bar. I'll just go ahead and accept that. What layer do I want to swipe? I can also swipe two different maps if I want. And I've only got one additional layer in my map, so it's already been selected here for me. Move on to the next, and what do I want in the layout? I don't really have a description, there's no legend needed, and there's no pop-up, so I can check those off, and now I'm ready to go. So a couple of clicks of the button after going through things with the builder, and I've got an application that's ready to deploy and ready to use. I did mention that story maps have multiple types of layouts, so one of the things I can do is change to this layout, which is called the Spyglass layout. I apply that, it reminds me I need to save and then reload the map, so we'll save. And we'll go ahead and reload the map. And now I've changed that vertical swipe into a little spyglass effect here. So just at the click of a little button I can do that. The other way that we can build story maps is by going to storymaps.arcgis.com, and this is where you'll find lots of useful information, some highlighted story maps. There's a gallery which you can peruse to learn and see what others have done, and they're organized by the story map app. So if I'm interested in using something called Cascade, I can click Cascade, and here's all the Cascade applications. If I'm interested in seeing what a bulleted map series looks like, I can click Filters there. And as we go down, you'll see along the left there's different subject filters, industry filters, and also some formats and who the author might be and so forth. This is a great place to start to learn more about story maps. There's a filter on the blog, so this rolls up all the blog posts about story maps. And there's also some additional resources, so there'll be lots of links here to all the resources you need to learn how to build story maps. But one of my favorite places, as I mentioned, is this thing called My Stories. At the top here, I've logged into my account, and it's automatically presented a list of all my story maps. You can see, here's the one I just made. And what we can do is we can click this button to check the stories, or I can check each one individually. And right now it's just going through all my story maps and looking for errors. When it finds ones that have errors, it'll mark those, and it'll also bubble those up to the top. Looks like the last one's the tough one here. Let's go ahead and click stop. All right, so it scanned 29 of 30 stories, and the ones with errors have appeared here. So here's one that has an error. If I open it up, it tells me exactly what the error is. And in this case, I've used an image that is no longer there. So I reference something from a Wikimedia site that's been deleted or removed or changed somehow, and so I understand what that error is here. Here's another one with an error. This one, it looks like I've got, again, some inaccessible images. So this is a great tool for you to monitor the health of your story maps and just check to make sure they're all up and running. Elsewhere on the site, and here, you'll find a button called Check Stories. You'll also find, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean Check Stories. I meant, let's bring up that button again, Create Story. And you'll find that here and there on the website as you begin exploring it. And Create Story is a really nifty little tool once you get used to some of the story maps. So here's a little one-sentence description of each of the 8 different story maps. So once you're familiar with those, you can go right here. You can also go right to the apps here, and you can just scroll down and read a little bit about them and launch the builder from here. But another neat thing with Create Story is you can ask the pros. So this will guide you to the correct story map for what you have in mind. So I've got in mind an application that's a set of places. I'll choose that. Do I want to show photos for each location? Yes, I do. Do I want to crowdsource places from your audience? No, I don't want to do that. Are my places organized into categories? No, they're not. Okay, but here's the recommended one. It's called the Map Tour, and I can go ahead and let's build. So this launches the builder for the Map Tour, and you'll see right away it's different than the one for Story Map Swipe. Now in this case, what I'll do is, best practice is you can add local photographs to not your ArcGIS Online account, but through the story map builder. And once you store them, they're stored inside the story map itself. So it's a nice little container, and that's the best way to add maps or photos to your story maps. It's because they're optimized for the web automatically when that's done and they're ready to use. I've got some some photos out on Flickr, and I have them in a little group here called ArcGIS Online Labs. And you're welcome to go visit that. And you can leverage these. The photos have to be in an album. A really cool thing about Flickr is that it stores photos at different resolutions, and the story map builder is smart enough to know to fetch the correct resolution photo for where it's going in the application. So a couple of weekends ago, I did a hike in Joshua Tree, just not far from here, and I took those photos with my camera, which geotagged them, and I'm going to select that album, and there I've already placed them on my map. I'll go ahead and import them into my story, so there's the start of the trail, and I can do some other things here, like maybe we'll choose the imagery base map. I can change the zoom setting. I can kind of navigate and go through these. There's all the photographs I took, and I can go ahead and organize these and drop them in different places. When I'm happy with things, I go ahead and save. And now I have a ready to deploy story map. Earlier I mentioned that one of the things we can do is we can change the layout, and this one has a different layout called the integrated layout. If I click apply, you see the map is now kind of behind everything, and now the photo is on the right. and I still have to go in and add some titles and some descriptions and so forth, but I'm pretty much on my way with the story map. So we'll come back and take a look at how to work with the source code in a bit, and now I'm turning things over to
me.
To Ian.
I think we do have a new layout for Map Tour coming out just after the conference.
Yeah, there's a number of changes that are happening with story maps as we speak, and there's some good things happening there. You're going to do Web App Builder?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So I'll do a brief section on Web App Builder. We don't have time to really do it justice. So if you're interested in Web App Builder, please find one of the dedicated sessions to that. So differently, Web App Builder works a little different than configurable apps in that you're not starting with a specific pre-configured application. You're starting usually with a map or with a scene, and then you're able to essentially choose a theme, a layout, and then configure widgets to support your use case. So one of the things that's a little bit different is because you can configure multiple widgets, they do have the capability to communicate with one another. Most of the configurable apps, when you're using one widget, that's all that's going to work in that moment. So let's just take a look at that in the wild here. Before we get there, I wanted to show one thing that I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with. Recently, we added this item information to the item page. And one of the things you can do is as you look at the item that you own, you can click this Learn More, and we give some tips that help you improve the quality of your item. So as I mentioned earlier, when you're doing something like creating a gallery or promoting authoritative content in your organization, it's really good to kind of take the time, review this item information, and make some changes. So in this case, it's basically telling me that I'm good with everything except for the description. It could be a little bit more robust. So I'm just going to, that's not what I wanted to paste in there. Use my favorite Ipsum generator to trick the system here. And when I save, now it says, well done, you filled out your item information, and I've got a perfect score. So the other thing that you can do from the item page is you can actually access the workflow to create a application. In this case, I'm looking at a web map. So when I choose create a web app, I'm going to see the options that support web maps. In this case, instead of using a template, I'm going to use Web App Builder. And since I've started with a specific map, it discovers all the content that's already been authored about it, the title, the tags, that sort of information. Then I'll enter the builder. And usually the first choice that you're posed with is which theme would you like to choose. There's a variety of themes. It looks like we've got 9 now. We've got everything from the launch pad, which I think some people like on mobile devices. There's a dashboard theme. My preference is really the box theme. I like this little box controller because it doesn't take up a lot of space. The other thing you can do on the theme tab is change the style. You can provide one of the pre-created styles, or you can set a custom style. And then you can also choose a layout for many of the themes. Next, we'll move on to the map tab. In this case, I've already authored my map. I'm pretty happy with it, but there are some things that you can do here. You can modify the visible scale ranges. You can override the default extent of the map. So there's a few things that are unique to Web App Builder on this map tab. Really the widgets tab is where the rubber meets the road. In this case, all I really want to do is, I'm going to add, let's take a look at these. I think I'm going to keep those 2 as my default widgets, and then I'm going to add a info summary widget. I think in my case, what I want to be able to do is, as I pan the map, get a count of the features that are presented. So I'm going to choose add layer, and I think in this case, I'm really going to be concerned with just one thing. I want to look at system valves, and I'm assuming that most of them are going to be green. Let's see. So each widget has its own capabilities to be configured. You can rename it. You can, let's call it valve summary. You can change the icon. And then because I've added it to the box controller, it's going to show up on the box controller. And it's going to tell me, right now I've got 39 valves. As I start to pan the map or zoom out, it'll tell me that there's more. And then you can drill down and see information about the specific valves that are in the map. So I think that's a kind of handy widget. I think at this point I'm comfortable with the application that I've made. The other thing I normally do for this is I tend to turn off some of the stuff that Web App Builder has on by default. But I'm not seeing, nope, it looks like they're all good. Normally the coordinates widget's on, and for some reason I have an agenda against that. Sorry if you're for it. Then the other thing that you can do in Web App Builder on the Attribute tab, you can change some of the branding of your application. You can preserve the app state. So if you leave the application and come back, you can preserve the settings that you've chosen. And then the other thing, I think Bernie mentioned this earlier, is this idea of subscriber content access. So in this case, my map doesn't have anything that would qualify as subscriber content. But if it did, this would be where you could go to essentially facilitate the general public to access your map. What it does on the behind the scenes is it creates a proxy that this application can use to access that premium or subscriber content without requiring a sign-in. The configurable apps support that in a similar way, and I think most of the story maps also support that. So it's a useful way to take some of the really high quality layers and maps that have been authored by the cartographers at Esri and add a little bit of background information to your information products. And with that, we'll just launch this and just take a quick look. I think I forgot to save. User error. Let's save. There we go. So it's that lovely plum-ish color. And I think I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So that's all I had with Web App Builder. So we'll turn it over to Derek to see Operations Dashboard.
Thanks, Ian. Can I go to the next slide? Thanks, Bernie. So Operations Dashboard is a new app that was recently released in December with the ArcGIS Online update. It's actually an app that's been around for several years, but we rebuilt the app from the ground up. So it's a brand new application, and it's tightly integrated within ArcGIS Online. Its purpose in life is basically to be a reporting app, if you will. Think of a report that you need to generate, or a single application that allows you to view multiple attributes for at-a-glance decision-making. So if you have key performance indicators, if you have senior management or project managers and they want to see the status of a project or the status of your data, this is the app for you. It's completely web browser-based, and it's built on the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. And it's also available within ArcGIS Enterprise. And as Bernie mentioned earlier, it's a new third option that's available inside the map viewer. Let's take a look. So you can see here I'm logged into my ArcGIS Online organization, and I'm looking at a map of some water sample data for the state of Maryland, and I'm inside the ArcGIS Online map viewer. So if I want to quickly and easily build a dashboard around this web map, I simply click Share, and then I can hit Create a Web App. So I can give it a name, Web Water Samples March 28, 2018 Dev Summit, and I can scroll down. Whoops, actually. Let me go back. Create web app. Done. And I apologize, but I skipped the Operations Dashboard panel, which is what I wanted to show you. But it was there, I promise you. I've already accessed the Operations Dashboard app. And by default, since I accessed the app through the map viewer, the map element automatically populated. So I can see, I can navigate my map, I can click on my features, and all my pop-up settings that I created or set in my web map are automatically honored. Now, just like with Web App Builder, I can configure my different elements. So I can hover my cursor in the upper left and click the Configure button. And here is where I can give it a map title. For example, I could type in water samples. Oops. State of Maryland. I could make it bold, maybe give it some color, center it, and also increase the text. Now I have a bunch of other options. I could turn the pop-ups off. Maybe I could add some simple map tools like allow my end user to change the layer visibility, change the base map, and have a zoom in, zoom out button. And when I hit done, you'll notice my map display has changed. I have my title, I have my simple controls in the upper right-hand corner, along with my zoom in, zoom out button. But what makes this app powerful and different is that I have several different visualization elements. For example, it might be useful for me to see a list of all my sample sites or all my water samples. So I simply click the Add Element button, I click List, and it asks me right away, what's the data source? In this case, which layer in my web map do I want to power my list element? I'll click my water samples layer, and you can see now I have a preview. On the left are my various configuration options. On my right is a real preview of how that list element will look. So right now I see my default symbology, I could apply a filter, but what I want to do is actually configure how my different items in my list will appear. So for now, I'll type in station ID, and I'll click this little drop down to grab my station number ID. Notice as I make the change, their preview updates in real time. I will also add another one, sample date, and again, I'll just choose my sample date information. I click done, and here is my list element. And I can configure the layout. Something else that might be useful, well, I'll click the plus button again, and I'll add a pie chart. I'll also choose my sample sites. But now I'm going to maybe draw a pie chart of all the different types of water bodies that I've sampled. You'll notice we have the Show Data Table button, so I can look at the raw data table. And what I'm going to do is show every single unique value from my water body type column. So I'll choose grouped values. I'll choose water body type, and if I go back to show preview, you can see I have my pie chart. Now I can spend some time configuring it and customizing it. I can modify my labels, modify my hover text. I can customize the color of my pie slices, add or remove categories, but for now I'll keep it simple, and I'll type in the title, types of water bodies. And again, I'll just make it bold, heading, blue, and I'll center it. So again, I have this element, and I'll simply click and drag it underneath my list element. So you can see it's very configurable. And this is a single display. At any point in time, if I think the chart's a little too small, I can click this expansion button to view it. I'll add one more element that might be useful. I can maybe add an indicator element for how many counties in the state of Maryland I sampled. So again, I'll hit the plus button, I'll choose indicator, I'll choose my Maryland counties web layer, and here I have the value 24. And I'll simply customize it by adding some bottom text, so counties sampled. And I can also add an icon. So I have this nice little gallery of pre-built icons. We also support custom icons if they're SVG files, and I'll just hit done. And I'll drag this indicator element on top of my chart. So now I have a stacked element where I can flip between the two. Hopefully you guys get the idea that you have the ability to create these very powerful interactive dashboards. And with that, I'll pass it back to Bernie. Is there a way to configure the size of the text? Yes, you can configure the text. I just didn't have time to do that.
That was pretty cool, though, wasn't it? It's really it's just a powerful application. Now hosted and easy to configure and set up. We're going to use up, we've been doing pretty good time-wise. We're going to use up the rest of the time, not only to answer some of your questions at the end, but also to talk about doing a little bit more and focusing just a little bit on developer options. So we'll launch into that section. But before we get into some of the real hardcore developer options, I did want to point out some other options that you have that maybe don't involve working with the source code, but are still really interesting for you to use. One of the things that you can do is embed a web map, and it actually is using the minimalist configurable application template to in the process of generating the HTML for how that embedded web map looks like. So it's almost like configuring an application, but you're doing it all through HTML, and then you can sort of copy and paste that into an existing web page. We'll take a look at that, but that's an interesting alternative to working with the configurable apps and gives you a lot of flexibility as well. Apps, of course, can be embedded in websites, and all you have to do is leverage that by using an iframe. These days, everything is about HTTPS. And if you haven't already, or if your customers haven't already, we encourage you to move your organizations over to HTTPS. So you can do that as an organization setting, and it's what we recommend. And it's something that everybody should do. There's some browsers that just complain unless they get that secure content. In the past, we've always, well, actually now, through this transition phase perhaps, as more and more organizations move to HTTP secure, when you use an iframe, use the protocol relative URL. So instead of explicitly saying HTTP, you can omit that and just start with the // and what that will do is it'll adopt the protocol of the hosting web page. So that's an easy way to accommodate both situations, but overall we recommend that you do move to HTTPS. The big difference is I did this with 2 of my organizations and I had a little bit of pain to pay. What was the pain? Well, some of my story maps, now of course they had to be HTTP secure, but they were using content that wasn't, like photos or videos that were coming from non-secure locations, and so they wouldn't display. So there is a little bit of work that you might have to do to migrate everything over into an HTTP secure environment, but it's relatively painless and something that we're all going to have to do if we haven't done so already. You can also embed apps in websites, and when you do, there's a couple things that we recommend that you keep in mind. First, allow some room for the app to breathe. Sometimes I see these little tiny apps with lots of capabilities in it, but they're scrunched into this really little tiny corner of a website. And in that case, it might actually be better just to include a link, or maybe even just a photo of the app, an image of the app, and then use that to hyperlink to open up the app in its full form. We always recommend that you maybe add a link that says view full application or view larger to open up the application outside of the context of the hosting website. Another good idea is that in a website, of course, you've got lots of text, there's other things going on in the website, and you might not need that header or other parts of the top of the application. So while you're authoring that, you can keep that in mind and minimize the UI when you're creating the application. You can embed story maps in websites, and there's a handy little URL parameter that you can add to the end of the story map URL, and it's &embed. And what that does is you can compare the left and the right images. It just removes the header, the sharing, the logo, and it just focuses on the functional capabilities of the story map app itself. And this is true for just about all of the story maps. There's a couple that don't support this, but this is a handy little thing to keep in mind if you're going to be embedding story maps in websites. You can also embed other apps in story maps. And this is an example. We'll take a look at this one. Story maps don't inherently support time in the story map, but there's a configurable application called Time Aware. And in this example, we've configured that application and then embedded it or added it to the story map, and that's how we're enabling this application to have a little time animation. And again, notice that the user interface has been minimized for embedding purposes. You can also embed story maps in story maps, and this is an example of a story map series that's been added to the main page of a story map journal. And once again, we're using a tabbed story map series, and you can see that once again we've minimized the UI for that using &embed so that it behaves really well in its intended end environment. For all of the configurable apps, source code is available. Just click the download button, and that you'll find the source code on GitHub along with some additional information. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you're doing this or doing this on behalf of your clients, that you have to self-host this somewhere. So they have to have their own servers, or you have to find your own mechanism for hosting the application. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that when you're hosting, when you're working at the source code level and hosting your own app, as changes get made, as they invariably do with almost every release, you're going to have to download the new application changes and then install that where you've got this hosted. So there's a couple of other extra things that you need to keep in mind when you're working at the source code level and working with your own hosting. And this is true for story maps as well as any of the configurable apps. Now, each map has a unique identifier. You can think of this as a social security number. So just like a social security number identifies us uniquely, this number identifies a map uniquely. And what that is useful for is when you're working at the source code level, there's a place where you can insert that unique map ID into the source code to make it work with your map instead of the default one. So this is in a couple of different places depending on the age of the template, or have we standardized all that by now?
Where it's located?
Yeah.
I think it's standardized for those that use the application boilerplate. It's kind of true form.
Okay, so Ian's saying it's pretty much standardized, but you might need to poke around a little bit just in case. But anyway, you'll find a place to insert that web map ID, and all you need to do is just copy and paste it in there. Story map source code you'll find at the Story Maps website. Again, that's storymaps.arcgis.com. All of that source code and instructions and other things are available on GitHub, and you'll find links in the Story Maps website to get some developer guides. There's a developer blog for Story Maps called the Story Maps Developers Corner, which is hosted out on Medium, and all those resources are linked in Story Maps.
For the Story Maps, you want the app ID in most cases.
Yes. So Ian has reminded me that for the story maps, in most cases, you don't need the map ID, you need the app ID in this case. So let's go ahead and take a look at those, and then I'll turn things over to Ian and Derek to carry a few things for it. So let's begin with, okay, so here's the web map that we were working with earlier. And what we did earlier is we shared it and opened up this create a web app template, which brought us to that gallery where we could begin our configuration. Let's do something a little bit different. I'm going to click embed in website. And again, this uses the minimalist template. It's actually one of the ones that you'll find here in the create a web app gallery. It's under showcase a map, and here is minimalist. So it's based on that template. But what it allows you to do is generate the HTML here based on what you choose. And there's a little icon, a little diagram here which shows what you might include. So there's a legend. You can see the little icon change. I might want to add a base map selector or a toggle, and we'll choose a second base map. We can have a view larger map. You just kind of make these choices, and when you're done, you copy this. Now, what I've got here, just to show how this works, I've got a couple of web pages. This is a fixed width web page. This one is a responsive web page. But let's go ahead and embed this into one of those web pages. So let's go to I'm going to open this up in Notepad. So here's the index.html for this web page that you're seeing here in the background, just a bunch of lorem ipsum dolor. So I'm going to find a place to insert it. I've added a little queue here for me, a nice place to dump it in there, and I'll just go ahead and paste that in there. So there's the HTML that was automatically generated for us. If I go ahead and save that, and let's refresh this page, you'll see I've got that configured application inserted now into this website. And there's my pop-ups. All that is just like I authored in the map. And then I've added some additional tools here, which let me do some additional things, including toggle the base map. So this is almost like custom configuring an application, or maybe even working at a source code level. So you can do some pretty interesting things with that. And the same works for the responsive websites as well. The code that you generate is responsive, so you can use it just about anywhere you want. Another thing that, let's do a little cleanup here. Another thing that we might want to do is we can leverage some CSS. There's places in the configurable apps where you can override how the app is currently configured. You can override colors. You can even add some overrides which control width of various things or add some interesting things. Ian's going to show some interesting examples of this in just a second. But this is a map which just has some bike paths here in Cupertino. And what I would like to do with this one is make an application. So I'm going to create a web app, and in this case, I'm going to look for the elevation profile, and we'll go ahead and let's preview it first and take a look at what the default looks like. So the way this works is as I click on one of these bike paths, clicked on that little section there, we can see we generate the terrain profile. But what I'd like to do is modify this a little bit. I'd like to override the colors, and I'd also like to stretch this out so that it fills the entire bottom part of the application. So the way we can do that is we'll create a web app, and we'll call this the profile app, give it a new name, and we'll click Done, and then we open up the configuration panel for the elevation profile configurable application. And as in the other configuration panels that Ian showed us, you'll see a lot of similarities. So the tabs at the top are where we can do various things. We can configure the various options, what might appear. We can change the theme, but here in general is actually under theme here is where I can add some custom CSS. So if you know a little bit of HTML or CSS, you can create some custom CSS. You'd use the inspector to identify the various CSS elements. And without going into a lot of detail, here's all the CSS that I'm going to copy. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in here. And I'm going to go ahead and save. And you'll see that the application changes. So you see those some color changes, and now you also see that the bar here at the bottom is now full screen. Let's go ahead and launch that. So that covers left to right now the entire width, and that's something that we did by adding that little bit of CSS to override the default styles, and there's the rest of the application. So there's some interesting opportunities here for you to just use some CSS and HTML to change on the fly an existing hosted application. To show you a real-world example of this, this is actually what was done by the Grand Canyon Trust. They've got this interesting little application which leverages one of those, in fact, that same configurable app that I just showed, and they've added the CSS which allows that application to work here in embedded mode inside their website. So some really neat things that you can do without having to do a lot of coding. Let's go on to a story map. This is a story map spyglass. We created one of these earlier, and I mentioned ampersand embed, and that's how we can minimize the UI for any of the story maps. So when I click ampersand embed, we remove the header, and that includes the title and the subtitle, the logos, the share links, and now we just have an application that I can embed in a story map. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy that, and if I remember, I'll use that in just a second. This is a story map that actually embeds a couple of other applications. This is a story map about the spread of a disease that's been killing millions of bats across the United States. And as I go here to this particular section, I've got the ability to look at the spread of the disease over time. Now the story map doesn't have this capability. What I've done is I've used the time-aware configurable application. I've minimized the header, the appearance of it, but I've used its capabilities and added it to the main stage of the story map to provide that capability in the story. Inside the map journal, which is what this is, a story map journal, there's a place where you can also edit HTML. And rather than use a legend that was available for the web map, I've used a little bit of HTML and CSS to style my own legend here and put it over here in the side panel. This next section shows an example of embedding a story map series inside a story map journal. And this is the story map series with the tabbed layout. The tabs here show the different species ranges for each of these species of bats. And this was a good place in the story to kind of use this. Notice I've used ampersand embed to minimize the header for this story map series since we don't need it. We've got lots of room for text and other things elsewhere in the story map. So there's some embedding. Let's go back to our map here, and let's once again share it. We'll go to the Create a Web App Gallery, and let's build another application. Let's select the basic viewer again, but this time rather than configure it as a hosted app, I want to download it and work with it at the source code level. So I'll click the download button. Now, a couple of things have happened here. I know. Ian's telling me, I know, I did this on purpose. Here it tells me what the web map ID is. So I've already got, I know what that is. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. Now, I could also get that from the URL of the web map itself. It's right here at the top. So that's where the web map ID is. Now, one thing that by default I have set up in my browser is that pop-ups are blocked, which is why nothing happened when I clicked to download this. But there it is. Pop-ups were blocked. Oh, there it is. What I want to do is I want to go ahead and open up that pop-up. And what it is it points me to the GitHub site where I'll find all the details and the source code for that basic viewer template. So instructions, how to set it up, how to deploy it, what the requirements are, all of that information is in the GitHub repo for this application. And here is where I can click the download button. Let's go ahead and download the zip file. And there's the zip file. It's now on my computer. Let's go ahead and show it in my download folder, and let's unpack it and take a look and see what's there. So we'll extract the contents of that folder, and here it is. And I know for this application template that where I need to insert the web map ID is in the config folder in the defaults.js file. So I'll edit that with Notepad, and as we scroll down, there it is. So this is where I insert my new web map ID, and I would save it, and then I would have to, again, install this application on my server to host it from there. So that's how simple it is to work with configurable app source code, and it's all available to you. And I think Ian's going to show some examples of some highly configured or customized applications. Wrapping up my part with story maps, when we explore the applications, as we learn more about them, I can look at the overview for any of these applications, and as I scroll down to the bottom, we will see instructions for developers. So I can download the app, I can get the source code on GitHub, and that's also where I'll get lots of little tips and tricks and tutorials about how to work with the source code. There's also an introduction to hosting the story map app, so there's some things you need to consider there because it does include the builder and some other components. And by the way, the source code for some of the story maps isn't trivial. It's actually quite expansive and does require a little bit of learning or a little bit of expertise. And then there's a link here to the Story Maps Developers Corner, which is that Medium-based blog which covers all sorts of topics for people that want to work at the source code level with story maps. Again, you got to download it and host it in your own environment, and you have to maintain your own updates as you go. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian.
We're running a little bit late, but if you can hold out for maybe 6 more minutes, Derek's got something to show with Developer Edition of Web App Builder, so I'll be quick. So this is using Story Map Basic to show a map that I made of tourism in Ireland. I think we saw this earlier. But what if I want to add just a little extra splash of style to it? I can use the custom CSS to override in the configuration panel to do that. And in this case, well, before I get there, so any application that supports it, it's going to show up near the bottom of the theme tab. I think in every case we call it custom CSS. And basically you'll have to kind of poke around either with the item inspector in the dev tools, or maybe go to GitHub and try to understand the structure of the CSS there. But what I've done here is basically applied a mask using a Shamrock SVG. And what you should see is my map is slightly, has a little bit more style because I've created this 4-leaf clover shape around my map. And basically I just used an SVG that I had on my server. And and then I use the CSS to style it. Another interesting example, this one's from Esri UK. They've written some CSS to style the minimalists. They've changed things like the toggle button. They removed the header text over here. And they even went so far as to really do a lot of styling of the pop-up. So you can do a lot with the custom CSS. The last, I got two more to show you. This one, we just added a really simple white banner with a logo and some text to the top of the basic viewer. And then the last one, this is using the GeoList with the newspaper vector base map. And I basically just mimicked the texture of the vector base map with a background image on this side panel. And with that, I'll turn it over to Derek.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I promise I will be done in a few minutes. I just wanted to briefly mention that Web App Builder also has a developer edition. I apologize. Thank you. So Web App Builder for ArcGIS also has a developer edition. So I encourage you, this is a developer summit, that you go to that session. But I wanted to mention to you that it's available, you download it, and it gets installed locally. So I've already gone ahead and done that, and you'll see here on my C drive, I actually have this folder called Web App Builder for ArcGIS version 2.7. I double-click Startup, and I have it running, because included with the software is this little web server called Node.js, which basically allows you to run Web App Builder Developer Edition locally on your machine. In this case, I've already installed it. I hit continue, and I sign into my ArcGIS Online organization. And once I do that, it will ask you, do you want to build an app? Okay? So I've already set up a template, or a framework, if you will, framework app, I guess, for Web App Builder. I'm going to click the Edit button, and as you'll see, even though it's called Developer Edition, it's got the exact same user experience as Web App Builder that Ian showed you inside ArcGIS Online or inside the Portal for ArcGIS component of ArcGIS Enterprise. Now what I wanted to show you is you might want to use Developer Edition if you want to use custom widgets. For example, if I go to the Widget tab, you'll see here the name of my app is Elevation Profile. I'll hit the plus widget button, and I don't actually have an elevation widget. So I'm going to hit Cancel. And what I'm going to do is if you go to GeoNet, which is our Esri kind of support discussion forum, there's actually a discussion place called Web App Builder Custom Widgets. And if I click the Content tab, you'll notice that we have various sample widgets given by Esri developers and also by people in our developer community. Now, one really popular widget is called the Elevation Profile widget, written by a gentleman named Robert Scheitlen. He's actually here. He is awesome. He makes tons of custom widgets. You simply read about the widget, and you click the zip file, and you download it. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded that zip file. And you can see I have it available in a folder called Attempt 2 Elevation Profile. So if I want to enable this custom widget in Web App Builder Developer Edition, it's really easy. I simply click on it, hit copy. I go into my Developer Edition installation directory. I go to Client, Sitemap, and inside the widgets folder, and all I have to do is paste. All right. Now when I go back to Web App Builder Developer Edition, and I can hit the plus sign, notice now I have actually an elevation profile widget. I hit OK, and the tool is added. It shows me how it works. I hit OK, and you can see it's part of my interface. And just for visualization purposes, I'm going to change to my imagery base map, and I'll zoom in here. And I can actually run this widget. So I'll click it. And it basically asks me to draw a line to define my profile. And now it runs. So this is pretty cool. It is that easy to get custom widget functionality and enable it locally. And with that, I will pass it back to Bernie.
Okay, we apologize for going over time. There's just a lot of stuff to cover, and I know we hurried through it, but I guess the important thing we're trying to underscore here is that configurable apps are cool because you don't have to do any programming. It's great for users, maybe not great if you're a developer because you want to value add to those and maybe do some interesting things, but there's two ways you can do that. You can do it at the CSS level, which is interesting, and there's also a way to get the source code for the configurable apps for story maps, not operations dashboard, but for the others, that source code is available and you can go ahead and work at the source code level. If you do that, the thing to keep in mind is that as Esri updates those apps, you have to download and install those updates into wherever it is that you're hosting your custom app. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so the question was about a story map that I showed, and what I did is I added geotagged photos from an album that I had in Flickr. So that's where they came from. I can show you again really quick. Flickr is a popular place that people use to publish their photographs, and if you turn, by default, when you add a geotagged photo to Flickr, it strips off the geotag information for privacy reasons. There's a user setting where you can turn that off, and if you turn that off, then what you're able to do is store geocoded photographs in your Flickr album. And as I type and talk at the same time, the builder, I used a map tour, a story map tour in that case. The builder for the map tour is smart enough to know the proper resolution of the Flickr stored photograph to use. So what I did is I've got in my Flickr account, I have a couple of different albums under a user called ArcGIS Online Labs, and you're welcome to kind of fish around there. And just to demonstrate the point, let's use a different album. Here's Mission Bay Reserve. And I'll go ahead and add those to my map, and because the photos are geotagged, they're already placed on the map. Now there's one here that isn't, and I'm going to do something special with that. I'm just going to put it out here in the bay just for a second. We'll click import and I'll show you what I'll do. Now in Flickr, I added a title and also added a description, so that has automatically been carried across. I've also added some inline HTML to add a more info link. This doesn't really have a proper place on the map. I want this to be an introduction, so I'm going to go and check this box and say, use the first point as an introduction so it won't appear in the carousel. I'll apply that, and now when I go ahead and save my application and refresh it, that'll be my title photograph, and it's not going to appear again after that. So that's how the geotagged photos got into the story map, and there it is. Okay, so the question is, if I just have photographs with geotag locations and I upload those to my ArcGIS Online account, can I put them on a map? And the answer is no, but you can cheat. Use this story map. It actually creates a feature layer with those photos attached to it, and you can just forget about the story map and use that layer in whatever other applications you want to use. So that's a real easy way to do that. We are going to be adding that functionality. It's not there yet, but that's a way to do it for now. Any other questions? Great, thanks for hanging with us. We'll be in the showcase tomorrow and Thursday. So if there's anything you want to see in detail, stop by there. Thanks.